Thomas Jefferson contributed in many ways to the founding of our nation. He wrote the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, created the University of Virginia, served as an ambassador to Europe from the United States, and served as a U.S. president from 1801 to 1809. Thomas Jefferson moved from his home state of Virginia and across the globe to Paris, France in 1784. His writings had influenced multiple European countries, especially France, to rebel against their tyrannous government, which led to the French Revolution. He was aware of his position as a national icon, but was hesitant to get too tangled in national matters. It wasn't until the storming of Bastille in July 14, 1789, that Jefferson was actively involved in the revolutionary effort. When Jefferson arrived back to America, he was chosen to be the first Secretary of State for the United States. As Secretary of State, he opposed the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in various topics, such as where the capital should be located and how to pay off the country's debt. After much debating amongst cabinet, they had made several compromises to please both sides of the issue. In 1796, he ran for President of the United States, but fell short 3 votes in the Electoral College, causing him to become Vice President, with John Adams as President.
The election of 1800 between the current President John Adams and the current Vice President Thomas Jefferson was one of the most dramatic elections in American history. Both sides were from opposing parties, and people believed that the decision would most likely destroy the nation. Overall, the Federalists' platform was to strengthen the central government, while the Democratic Republicans wanted more public input and participation. The election's outcome brought a dramatic victory for Democratic Republicans who swept both houses of Congress, including a decisive 65-39 majority in the House of Representatives. However, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr received the same amount of votes. The tie thus had to be resolved by the House of Representatives, with each state casting 1 vote. After numerous block ballots, in which lawmakers were said to have collapsed to the floor in fatigue, Hamilton helped to secure the presidency for Jefferson, the man he felt was the lesser of 2 evils. As the first peaceful transition of political power between opposing parties in U.S. history, the election of 1800, commonly known as the Revolution of 1800, had great significance. Jefferson appreciated the momentous change, and in his inaugural address, he called for reconciliation by declaring that "we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists."
Federalists such as Alexander Hamilton despised and feared Jefferson. Since he was the first Democratic Republican to be elected president, the Federalists thought that he was going to weaken the national government and destroy Hamilton's economic plan for a national bank.
The 12th Amendment refined the way the Vice President and President were elected. It replaced Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, which provided the original procedure by which the Electoral College functioned. Under the original procedure for the Electoral College, as provided in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, each elector could vote for 2 people. The 2 people chosen by the elector could not both inhabit the same state as that elector. The 12th Amendment enforces that each elector must cast distinct votes for president and vice president, instead of 2 votes for president. Additionally, electors may not vote for presidential and vice presidential candidates who both reside in the elector's state. At least one of them must be an inhabitant of another state.
Albert Gallatin was a Swiss-American ethnologist, linguist, politician, diplomat, congressman, and the longest-serving United States Secretary of the Treasury. Gallatin's mastery of public finance, an ability rare among the members of the Jeffersonian Party, led to his automatic choice as Secretary of the Treasury by Thomas Jefferson, despite Federalist attacks that he was a foreigner with a French accent. He was Secretary from 1801 to 1813 under Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the longest tenure of this office in American history. In foreign affairs, the Federalists detested the French Revolution of 1789 because it led to mob rule and the confiscation of property. Shortly after becoming president, Adams sent diplomats to France to smooth over the bad feelings, but 3 French representatives, dubbed X, Y, and Z, met secretly with the U.S. diplomats and demanded $10 million in bribes to the French government to begin negotiations. When the Americans refused, Mr. X threatened the United States with the power and violence of France. News of the XYZ affair enraged most Americans. Many Federalists immediately called for war against France. President Adams, however, only proposed war preparations and a land tax to pay for them. On the defensive, Democratic Republicans spoke out against the war fever. The Federalists increasingly accused Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans of being a traitorous French party. A leading Federalist newspaper proclaimed to the nation, "He that is not for us is against us."
The Federalists believed that once people had elected their political leaders, no one should be able to publicly criticize them. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, aimed to create a stable and secure country, safe for business and wealthy men of property. Rumors of a French invasion and enemy spies frightened many Americans. President Adams warned that foreign influence within the United States was dangerous and therefore must be exterminated. In general, sedition means inciting others to resist or rebel against lawful authority. The U.S. Sedition Act first outlawed conspiracies to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Going further, the act made it illegal for anyone to express any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the President. However, the act did not specifically protect the Vice President, who of course was Jefferson. Additional language punished any spoken or published words that had bad influence to defame the government or to cause the hatred of the people toward it. One Republican was convicted of sedition for publishing a pro-Jefferson campaign pamphlet that accused President Adams of appointing corrupt judges and ambassadors. A drunk man was also fined $150 for insulting President Adams. In the end, the people decided that they had had enough, and in 1800 they elected Thomas Jefferson as president. In his inaugural address, Jefferson confirmed the new definition of free speech and press as the right of Americans to think freely and to speak and write what they think. Jefferson abolished the previous acts. However, the Alien Friends Act, authorizing the president to deport resident aliens if their home countries were at war with the United States, is still in effect today. On March 3rd, just before his term was about to end, Adams appointed 16 Federalist Circuit judges and 42 Federalist Justices of the Peace to offices created by the Judiciary Act of 1801. These appointees, the infamous Midnight Judges, included William Marbury, a prosperous financier in Maryland. As soon as Jefferson was in office, he ordered the acting Secretary of State to not deliver the remaining commissions that Adams had not been able to deliver. Without the commissions, the appointees were unable to assume the offices and duties to which they had been appointed to. In Jefferson's opinion, the undelivered commissions, not having been delivered on time, were void. The people that were let off eventually signed a petition because they thought that they were legally appointed by the previous president, therefore they had the right to stay in their position. This petition was sent to the Supreme Court, and as a result, Marbury sued, saying that the president couldn't take his job away. However, although the Supreme Court found that Marbury had a point, they weren't able to do anything because Article 3 of the Constitution didn't allow it. Still, Marbury said that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act gave the court power to make a decision. The Supreme Court refuted that whenever a law were to contradict the Constitution in any way, the Supreme Court had the right to rule it as unconstitutional, and if such a law exists, it would be voided. This extended the court's power, and Marbury was no longer Justice of the Peace. The Haitian Revolution was an anti-slavery movement in Haiti, which at the time was ruled by France. It has been the most successful anti-slavery movement in all of recorded history. During the revolution, Haiti was one of the richest countries in the world, mostly due to the fact that there was massive slave labor to harvest cash crops. The revolution started in 1791 when the slaves used whatever tools they could find and rioted. They were led by Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave with no prior military experience. One of the main points of the revolution was that it was happening during the French Revolution, so there wasn't much input from the French government to stop the rebelling slaves. It wasn't until Napoleon took power that he decided to make a peace treaty with Haiti, which became the second free country in the New World. The French invited Toussaint to France with a safe conduct, which was abolished when he arrived. The French imprisoned him and he died in jail. At the end of the revolution, not only was slavery abolished, but also the French rule.
Rebellion, also known as the Whiskey Insurrection, was a tax protest in the United States beginning in 1791. During the presidency of George Washington, the so-called whiskey tax was the first tax imposed on a domestic product by the newly formed federal government. It became law in 1791 and was intended to generate revenue to help reduce the national debt. Although the tax applied to all distilled spirits, whiskey was by far the most popular distilled beverage in the 18th century U.S. Because of this, the excise became widely known as a whiskey tax. The new excise was a part of the U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's program to fund war debt accumulated during the Revolutionary War. Jefferson was against the whiskey tax, as well as everything else to do with Hamilton, and repealed the act once he was elected president. Traditionally, laissez-faire is coined from a French phrase meaning allowed to do. It is known to represent a strain of economic and political thought that calls for minimum government intervention in a private sector. Characterized by a hands-off approach by the government in hopes of having private sector solutions for private sector problems. Thomas Jefferson had a laissez-faire economic policy where people followed their own pursuits to produce a living based on their own goals and objectives. He believed that America should be totally self-sufficient.
It's too late.